Silicon Flatirons is a research center at Colorado Law School. We work with students to give them the tools they need to pursue careers in tech, law, policy, and entrepreneurship.
When I started, Silicon Flatirons was an experiment. It was me and some students putting on a few conferences without really a plan where it was going to go. My initial motivation was because I didn't believe you could have impactful policy discussions unless you brought people together across different disciplines. Silicon Flatirons Center has given me an image of what a team can look like.
And it really made Boulder into a location that was seen as on par with DC or Silicon Valley and other places around the country that are leading thought centers in the field of law and tech.
What's excited me the most is to see it grow, but not only just grow in terms of the number of people attending our different events, but growing in terms of the different areas that we have been involved in.
When a law student says, I've got a passion for understanding the intersection of technology and law, but where do I get started with that? What Flatirons provides is a position to actually go angle for a job during their second summer, where they're actually going to get to be involved directly in setting tech policy or in advocating around tech policy.
The Silicon Flatirons community is incredibly unique in how close it is and how people are willing to band together to move conversations forward.
It's one thing to be sitting in a room by yourself reading articles, and it's very much another thing to actually be sitting at a table talking to somebody about their daily experiences of trying to navigate compliance with a complex new law.
We're all a community of friends who enjoy spending time with one another.
The people we engage with through here are very much thinkers and thought leaders, so they're contributing to whether it's our strategy or our resources in really meaningful ways.
Silicon Flatirons has changed the dynamic between Colorado law and the surrounding community as well as the national community.
One of the great joys of my profession is talking to people who are really early in their careers and helping them get excited about what you're excited about.
We get the types of people in the room that everyone thinks should be talking to one another, but often are not.
I get to work with students, I get to work with attorneys, I get to work with policymakers at the intersection of all these issues.
Students are first and foremost, so everything is generally student-driven.
And it is centered around people who are wanting to engage with students.
I've seen students come into Silicon Flatirons just having a little interest in it, in year one, and by year three, they're passionate about it and they found their career.
And I think that that really helps the standing of the university more broadly, and it also attracts lots of really interesting and talented speakers.
I think what I'm excited to see happen with Silicon Flatirons in the next 5, 10, even 20 years is for it to blend continuity with change.
It's not enough to have smaller conversations anymore. The world is all connected, and Silicon Flatirons is going to reflect that global nature of the internet as we move forward into 20 years in the future.
I hope it continues to operate with the same spirit of experimentation, of adventure, of seeking out new challenges that we've done over the first 20 years.
So we were going to have a little bit of time for some housekeeping notes, but we're experiencing our first technical difficulties today. But we'll go ahead and get started, even though it's a tad bit early. So hello, everyone. Oh, Vanessa's up.
Hi, everyone. Zoom did a little trick on me, but I'm here. My name's Vanessa. I'm the Senior Events Manager for Silicon Flatirons. I have a couple housekeeping notes for you all. Thank you so much for joining us online. I miss seeing you in person, but we're so glad we could have you here. This is the Zoom webinar format, and in case you're unfamiliar, if you're in the audience, we cannot see or hear you, so don't worry about it. There is a Q&A option available. You are encouraged to upvote any questions that are very important to you, which means you can click on the thumbs up and it will move its way to the top if there are more votes for that. I know there's been a lot of really great questions so far. For those of you seeking CLE credit, I will send a survey out by end of day today that will also have the affidavit link attached. And CLE materials are available from the event webpage, the event map. And if you don't need any CLE and don't know what that is, don't worry about it. We will be having an Air Meet social lounge after our last panel concludes to encourage socializing. It's a lot of fun. It was very worthwhile on our first day, and I hope to see you there. And with that, I'll hand things back over to Keith.
Okay, thank you, Vanessa. And hello, everyone, and welcome to day 2 of our Silicon Flatirons Conference on Evidence-Based Spectrum Policy. We're delighted to have you all here today, and I think today is going to be another great program, and I'm looking forward to some great talks and some great discussions. We had some interesting speeches and discussions on Tuesday. I'd like to call attention in particular to Dale Hatfield's speech, which generated quite a lot of interest, and we've had several requests for a transcript. So both Diaga's keynote slides and Dale's script have been posted to the event page. Before I go any further, I want to begin by acknowledging that wherever we are meeting on the lands of First Nations peoples. The traditional peoples of the land in Boulder are the Cheyenne, Arapaho, and Ute nations, and I'd like to pay particular respects to the elders past, present, and emerging who lead these communities. Thank you. The format today is much the same as Tuesday. We'll have a keynote address, panel discussions after that to explore the issues concerning evidence and spectrum policy, Q&A following each panel, and then, as was stated earlier, a virtual breakout room at the end of each day. And we're trying to capture the hallway experience that you get from a face-to-face conference by setting up virtual environments using the Air Meet collaboration tool to give attendees the opportunity to interact with the panelists, the speakers, and the moderators. A couple of reminders to moderators and panelists. First, Silicon Flatirons follows the WISER rule, in which students get the first question. Also need to remind everybody of the no acronym rule. Remember that audience and panelists may be from different domains. Please define all acronyms on first use. And in Air Meet, a table is set up for each moderator, panelist, and keynote speaker at the end of the day. It may take a minute or two to get started, but once you're in, you should move to your table and take a seat, because you aren't automatically placed at your table. You actually have to take the effort and take a seat. And with that, let me hand off to Rachel Anderson to introduce our keynote speaker for today. Rachel.
Thanks so much, Keith. Our keynote this morning is from Eric Berger, who currently serves as the Assistant Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy at the White House. He was previously the Chief Technology Officer at the Federal Communications Commission from 2017 to 2019. Dr. Berger, take it away.
Rachel, thank you so much for an awesome, succinct introduction. First, I wanted to thank the University of Colorado Boulder and the Silicon Flatirons for inviting me to speak today. I've always enjoyed the panels at Silicon Flatirons, both participating and especially the audience interaction. I'm disappointed we cannot be meeting in person, but I hope that next year we can gather in person. As Keith noted, it is hard to follow Dale's keynote. Many of you in the virtual audience, including me, owe a lot to Dale for his mentorship, advice, and more especially his sense of humor. Also, I don't have Diaga's cool background, so as in visible background. Actually, I don't have his technical background either. With that, let me jump in. The administration identified 5G to be a critical component of the industries of the future. The industries of the future, besides 5G and advanced communications, include AI, quantum information sciences, biotechnology, and advanced manufacturing. These all require vast amounts of data and interconnection with many, many more wireless devices than legacy wireless networks can support. American leadership in 5G is critical for economic growth and national security. With that in mind, the President and his administration have taken decisive actions to advance American leadership in 5G. We are accomplishing this on multiple fronts: freeing up mid-band spectrum, cutting taxes and removing regulatory hurdles in order to boost investment and accelerate deployments, securing America's communications networks from foreign adversaries, and preventing the spread of untrusted network equipment around the world, just to name a few. Some of the readings for this conference, as well as some of the discussion on Tuesday, debated evidence-based policymaking versus policy-based evidence-making. I am not going to go there. However, I will focus on how a specific policy goal tied to evidence, namely technology, physics, economics, and operations research science, resulted in the unprecedented freeing of 100 megahertz of prime 5G mid-band spectrum from federal to commercial use, all while ensuring America's military readiness. This was the AMBIT process. AMBIT stands for America's Mid-Band Initiative Team. The key word for this effort is team. This was an example of the federal government at its best. There was fantastic cooperation across departments and agencies, leading to unprecedented results for the American people, as well as DoD. This was the fastest time from identification of spectrum to making it available for commercial use. It's the fastest transition plan development and the fastest time to auction, limited only by the Commercial Spectrum Enhancement Act, or CSEA. So first, let's look at how spectrum was made available in the past. One hugely successful auction was the Advanced Wireless Services 3 auction, or for the FCC wonks in the audience, Auction 97. That auction raised just shy of $50 million, that's billion, dollars in winning bids. From a financial perspective, it was a winner. NTIA identified the spectrum at the end of 2010, and DoD was by far the largest user in the AWS-3 band. Just 4 years later, the FCC started the auction. 4 years between identification and auction is not too bad. However, according to NTIA's latest report to Congress, federal agencies are still clearing assets out of the band, almost 6 years after the auction closed. Well, could we do better? Well, let's take a look at the Citizens Broadband Radio Service, or CBRS. NTIA identified the CBRS bands to have potential for private sector use. NTIA, the Federal Communications Commission, or FCC, and DoD, Department of Defense, negotiated a scheme where DoD would continue to use the band. DoD would share the band with private sector priority licensees when DoD was not using the band. And then unlicensed users could use the band when no one else is using it. This coordination happens through a spectrum access system coupled with low power service rules. A lot of science went into CBRS. The players spent most of the time between identification of the band and auction by answering the question, how can we allow commercial users to share federal spectrum without harming the incumbent user? I would offer we successfully answered that question, even if it means low power operation that might be shut off with literally 1 minute's notice. How long did it take to answer that question? Well, NTIA identified the CBRS band in the same report that identified the AWS-3 band back in 2010. I'll note the FCC completed the CBRS auction a little under 2 months ago. or almost a decade after NTIA identified the band as eligible for commercial use. Now, one might point out that DoD did not operate everywhere in the US in the CBRS band. Which this meant was DoD operations significantly impacts only about 40% of the US population and over 80% of mobile customers. That is not exactly the most ideal situation for commercial deployment. So what did we do with the AMBIT process? In November 2019, the President gave a charge to DoD and OSTP to make 100 megahertz of contiguous mid-band spectrum available coast to coast at full commercial power with an auction starting in 2021. That was a very clear policy directive. But what about the evidence for evidence-based policymaking? The good news here is physics is physics. The bad news is DoD's operation in the band are generally matters of national security, and disclosure could compromise those operations. Given that situation, OSTP assembled a team of cleared experts. They were some of the leading radar academics, as well as former Navy and Air Force radar systems designers. That was our platform for collecting preliminary evidence to formulate the right question. So I would offer, to answer this question of what made this exercise the fastest expected transition of spectrum from federal to commercial use ever. Well, jumping off from what my colleague from Canada, Adam Scott, identified on Tuesday at this conference, we reformulated the question. The usual question asked when repurposing federal spectrum is one or a combination of the traditional COATS approach, that is, if the private sector's use of the spectrum is more valuable than the incumbent federal use, will an auction prove the hypothesis by raising enough funds to pay to vacate the federal users from the spectrum? Or the conventional sharing approach, where the question is, how can federal users share spectrum with private sector users without disruption to federal users? AWS-3, for the most part, with an asterisk which I will get to in a moment, is an exemplar of the former approach, and CBRS is an exemplar of the latter. Our innovation was reframing the question in a new way. We asked, if federal users could not fully vacate the band, how can federal users change their operations to get out of the way of commercial users? In other words, we were exploring a third way. Instead of either forcing federal users to vacate the band or putting a squeeze on commercial users, could we make the spectrum effectively available without a total move of the incumbent federal users? Given that reformulated question, OSTP's experts did a preliminary analysis and realized that we could make the same contiguous 100 megahertz block available coast to coast. That's the 3450 to 3550 megahertz band. We also realized that because of the high density of critical systems in the band in Alaska and Hawaii, coast to coast would be for the contiguous lower 48. It would be at full commercial power, and I'm going to bring in that AWS-3 asterisk again, which I'll get to in a minute, and all while protecting DoD's mission readiness and thus protecting the nation. With the reformulated policy informed by the evidence we'd gathered from the President, a 6-month process began to work out the details. So how did we do it? It was a collaborative process. DoD, the White House, OSTP, NTIA, and the FCC, as well as others like OMB, worked together. It was not the usual case of NTIA telling DoD to free spectrum, DoD coming up with a plan, and delivering that plan over the transom to the White House. Rather, we all worked together. Given the utmost importance of protecting the nation's security, over 180 people, mostly from DoD, more especially from DoD Service Branch Operations, as well as personnel from the FCC and NTIA, collaborated together on the analysis and development of new operating plans and procedures to make DoD operations in the band transparent to commercial users. The result of the first pass of that exercise was we found that 93% of the population of the US could have full power commercial mid-band 5G service all the time, simply through changing the way DoD used the spectrum. So what about the remaining 7%? Addressing that, the basic principles we had were to minimize or eliminate DoD's use of the spectrum, to do geographic concentration. So for example, in the White Sands Missile Range in New Mexico, there are a lot of missiles and not many people looking for commercial 5G service. So, concentrating DoD's use there. And temporal avoidance. So for example, when doing maintenance of DoD systems where you have to turn the radars on, do it late at night during times of low commercial use. DoD had a realization as we were working through this process. In the old way of doing things, we would come up with hard and fast worst case service rules to protect DoD, to protect the incumbent. And this is where the above mentioned AWS 3* comes up. During the long transition for AWS 3, DoD, NTIA, and industry have been working together to work out the various idiosyncrasies of particular deployment locations, like near aviation radars. The DoD's realization was that if industry worked cooperatively with DoD on deployment up front, as well as during operations if there are still national security needs for occasional use of the spectrum, then commercial users could have much more spectrum to use for much more of the time. What does this cooperative planning look like? Well, examples are things like, please don't point your 5G antenna beams directly into the aperture of my radar. There isn't anyone there that wants service. They would be cooked, and it messes up my radar. And likewise, the other way, be aware of very high power transmitters around the corner from your 5G antenna. And the side lobes or out-of-band emissions from that radar could melt an unprotected 5G receiver. You might want to protect it because DoD won't be buying you a new one. There are still some areas covering about 1% of the population where DoD still needs occasional exclusive access to the band for national security purposes. For the most part, we are talking about once a month for a few minutes at 3 o'clock in the morning, or semi-annual exercises that DoD plans more than a year in advance. The expectation is that for the most part, although DoD will get exclusive use to the spectrum, there will be at times that commercial users won't be using it, making the DoD use transparent from a commercial perspective. There is a small portion of the contiguous US, about 4% of the population, that cannot reliably get the full 100 megahertz all the time due to an airborne system that eats 40 megahertz of the spectrum. The ambit solution is to make the 60 megahertz that is available, to make it available at full power immediately, and work with the private sector on how to deploy on a much more limited basis in the 40 megahertz that DoD still occasionally uses. The long-term plan, paid for with auction proceeds, is to move that particular system out of the band. However, unlike other auctions, use can begin immediately. Contrast this with the old way, which was to wait for the auction to conclude, acquire new systems, deploy the new systems, and only then can commercial use start. So what does this mean for evidence-based policymaking? As noted earlier, how we ask the policy question really does frame the solution space. CBRS asked the question, how can DoD share with industry without impact to DoD? Over 10 years, evidence was collected, rules proposed, spectrum was made available, and auctioned or used by rule or used in unlicensed manner. Ambit asks the question, how can DoD get out of the way of industry without adversely impacting readiness? Over 6 months, evidence was collected, rules proposed, and we were expecting an auction within a year. More importantly, that spectrum will be available for full commercial deployment at full power immediately after the auction. So with that, I want to again thank Rachel for the great introduction, Keith for keeping this all together, and for your time and patience looking at my picture with all that hair in the background. Thank you all very much.
Thanks so much, Mr. Berger. Following the WISER rule, we're going to have a student ask the first question. So with that, I would love to invite Sloan to unmute and go ahead and ask your question.
Hi, thank you for being here today. It was great listening to you speak about a lot of things that I did not personally know. I am currently a 2L at Colorado Law, and my question for you today is, with so much passion behind evidence-based analysis into spectrum, there's still a step one, and that step one is convincing others that that evidence matters. How do you ensure that the people who make decisions are taking the evidence that you have scraped and found as true?
Well, thank you, Sloan, for your question, and good luck. You're at this point, I think, almost halfway there to being done. So good luck with the studies there. I think it is a case of success breeding success. And this process that we went through didn't do necessarily. There was the top down, which was that policy cut of we want more mid-band spectrum available, make it happen. But then, we had that phase of, really formulating the question. And that did take, a little bit of research. I think part of the success here and in other areas of the government that, taking a pause, collecting the evidence of how best to get that policy goal achieved, and then kind of running with it. Because if you think about it, once you have the question asked properly, then that's where, the expert agencies can really do their expert thing and, collect the information and do the analyses and run the cost benefit analysis that's necessary to come up with good, either laws or rulemakings or policies and procedures.
Thank you so much for answering. I hope that you have a great rest of your speech and keynote.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, this is such an interesting framing, like you're talking about a reframing of the question. And having worked this summer for NTIA, I worked with so many really brilliant people. And something that came up yesterday in the talk, I'm not sure if you were able to listen in, but something that came up yesterday was Paul Claudsey was pointing out that a lot of times the engineers are getting so bogged down in one question and then the question will change. And he was saying it would be so helpful if we could follow that question to its root, come to a solution and then move on. So did you find in that process that in the collaborative effort of all of these agencies that was something you experienced across the board, or was it easier? It sounds like it was easier having the policy objective very clearly on the front end of this task.
Yeah, I guess that's, thank you, Rachel. And that is kind of, addressing this, policy formulation. this is, and we think, and a few of you may end up, like on ENC or something like that, doing the laws. The successful laws are, here's the policy objective for the nation. Like we want, everyone to have high-speed broadband access, or, they want to be able to afford it, or, whatever the policy objective is, as opposed to, we want to have, everyone to have broadband access, and we're going to do it this way. It seems to always be best to leave the, we're going to do it this way to the scientists and engineers and economists. And, we did have the, how should we say, luxury of, being given the endpoint and, importantly, the timeline. Given the timeline we had, we couldn't spend 10 years, or you could say we spent 10 years doing CBRS. We couldn't spend another 3 or 4 years extending it into this band. We had to really look for novel ways of approaching the problem. So that's that would be the, and in a sense, it's also the caveat, because the engineers and economists and lawyers in the expert agencies, if Congress tells them you've got to do X, they're kind of constrained. They got to do X. If that X is high level and it allows them to come up with innovative ways of doing it, that's great. But if X is highly specific, then you got to do what the law says. So thank you.
Yeah, and I believe we have time for one more question coming from Keith. Keith?
Hello, thank you for the talk, Eric. That was great. I want to touch back on the CBRS. So we've just completed the auction for that, and deployments are going to start. And that is kind of one very significant step towards, towards dynamic spectrum sharing. So what do you expect to be learning from the CBRS experiment? And if you pull out your crystal ball, what direction is spectrum sharing going to be going? Are you going to reduce the sizes of the areas, like CBRS is county sized, or more dynamic, smaller time intervals? Where do you think we're going to be going in the future on this?
Well, Keith, thank you. That's great, because now I can wax poetic in my OSTP R&D role. You may be aware the DARPA, successfully completed last October the Spectrum Collaboration Challenge. And for those, and I'm guessing especially the lawyers who might not be aware of what that was, it's like the typical DARPA, let's have a competition. And it was like the ultimate in co-opetition. There were a number of teams, and it was driving both software-defined radio, cognitive radio technology, AI, but also cooperation, because the winning team was not who could jam everyone else so that they could use the spectrum. Basically, they were given spectrum. There were incumbents there, and those incumbents were modeling like cellular providers. They were modeling television distribution systems. And this was, how can you use all the spectrum around those incumbent users? And in fact, they did have to change the rules, because early on, the winning algorithms were the one that crushed everyone else. So only their stuff got through, and it didn't get through very much. So the rules were changed a little bit. And basically, everyone had to get some aggregate through. And then whoever got the most above that got the extra points and won. And they did announce the winners back in October. And so this concept of, AI cognitive radio has a lot of potential for, as Keith, you were saying, really small moment by moment, and in the the DARPA world, it was, in milliseconds. The CBRS world is, minutes to longer. So you can envision a future world where, spectrum sharing is either, like hyper efficient, what we today called unlicensed, because if you think about it, Wi-Fi is a cooperative protocol. And in places where you still have incumbents that, no joke, really need to be protected, which would be like ballistic missile defense. I think we would all agree ballistic missile defense is kind of important to the nation. That, you have, some sort of coordinated spectrum access system, like we see with CBRS. So they're not at all mutually exclusive. It's not that, well, CBRS is the only way we'll, you can guess who you might use something, but you still got to check in. I don't know that that's necessary in all bands. And likewise, I don't know that, a pure AI solution is necessarily the way to go. And you've got a lot of, critical communications, whether it's, ballistic missile defense or, FirstNet, radio responders. It's kind of a little bit wasteful when you're in normal times, and when you have an emergency that takes down a bunch of your communications network, you really need, some dedicated spectrum for people to be able to respond. So the answer is all of the above. A lot of exciting work, both at DARPA. They've got follow-ons to, more of this cognitive radio, as well as NSF has got a lot of programs going on in that area as well. So thank you. That was great. Great question.
Well, thank you very much, Eric. I'd love to ask you some more questions, but we need to move on to our panel. So thanks again. Very interesting points you bring up.
Thank you very much. You're welcome, and good luck for everyone for the rest of the conference. Thank you.
So before I introduce the moderator for the next panel, we seem to have lost two of our panelists in the crowd attending here. Chris Gregory, can you raise your hand on whatever screen you're on so that we can promote you to a panelist? And Stephen Yusko, could you please do the same? Oh, I see Chris now.
I think I'm in the right place.
Okay. Okay, so our first panel for the day is on evidence and spectrum sharing among active and passive services. The moderator for this is Doug Kinkoff. Doug is an associate administrator of the NTIA, National Telecommunications and Information Administration, following my own no acronym rule. I had the pleasure of working with Doug while I was at NTIA. And while there, Doug worked on areas as diverse as spectrum management, public safety communications, and broadband deployment. So he's got quite a background in this area. So Doug, over to you for the panel.
Thank you, Keith. And I would reiterate that I also enjoyed working with you during your years at NTIA out there at ITS Boulder Labs. I am not on the screen because I had some technical difficulties, but I'm joining you at least by phone. And good morning. It's a pleasure to be moderating the panel today on spectrum sharing policy among active and passive services. And I will say that from time to time, this issue has popped up on my plate. We don't have a lot of time. This is a subject that we could spend a lot of time addressing. So let me quickly introduce today's panelists. Their full bios are on the Flatiron website. I'm going to just do an abbreviated introduction. First, we have Chris Gregory. He's Vice President Engineering at Hawkeye 360, and radio frequency geolocation analytics firm that deploys a constellation of low Earth orbiting, or LEO, small satellites. Jennifer Manner is our second panelist. She is Senior Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at EchoStar Corporation and Hughes Network Systems. Next, Chris Turney is an electronics engineer with the Federal Aviation Administration Spectrum Planning and International Team. Spectrum Engineering Group. And finally, Dr. Ashley Zader is a program director in the Division of Astronautical Sciences within the Directorate of Mathematical and Physical Sciences at the National Science Foundation. Before I jump into the questions and we kick this discussion off, I just want to ask the panelists if anybody has any quick remarks they'd like to give. Okay. Well, let's kick this off. First, I think it's important to get a feel. Keith, we've read the abstract you guys have written. I've read David's opening kind of setting the stage remarks, which I thought were great. I'd like to get a feel from each of the panelists, and this is, I usually don't run right down the list, but I'd like to get a feel from each of them of what does evidence mean for spectrum sharing among active and passive services relative to your unique position in the field. So if we could start off with Chris, that would be great. Chris?
Yeah, thank you. I guess I'll just start by saying, I'm an engineer and not a lawyer, and so for me, I'm coming at this from the standpoint of collecting evidence using tools that are designed to sense RF energy and to geolocate the origin of that RF energy. What it means to me is it sounds like we have multiple people who want to use the spectrum. They don't want to interfere with one another. And I think where Hawkeye 360 and our technology fits in, really both for the active and the passive users, is anyone who is suspecting interference or experiencing some kind of interference can be helped by a technology that can search for not only the signals that potentially may be interfering, but also try to pinpoint the location. Passive users who may be, doing radio astronomy and may be bothered by someone using L-band sat phone technology too close to their devices could be aided by our technology to find and potentially notify the user that's jamming them. And then active services, in terms of making sure that spectrum is truly clear where it's supposed to be clear, and being used where it's supposed to be used. Anything to, I view our role as a tool provider and a source of evidence that can then be used by folks who would enforce policy.
Okay, thank you, Chris. I'm just going to go right down if you have any remarks, Jennifer.
Sure, sorry, I'm not so, I have a large dog who likes to bark, so I'm always on mute, so it takes me a second and come off. So anyway, thank you, Doug, and thank you to Silicon Flatirons for having me. I'm a lawyer, but I like to think I'm somewhat fact-based and analytical on how I do things. And I've been giving a lot of thought, Doug, to this and the other questions you sent us, and I'm not quite sure quite how to answer your question, but let me start by saying I think there's many ways successfully for passive and active services to share together. And I spent a lot of time over the past few days reading all the papers on evidence-based decision-making and so forth, and really thinking this through. And I do think spectrum sharing is possible. We've been successful both at my company and other companies I work for. Chris Geiger, I used to work for MSV and Skyterra before it was Legato, so I know a lot about the L-band there, and successfully shared as an MSS operator for a number of years with a number of services, and same with my current company. I think, Doug, what this really comes down to, though, to do this successfully, is which I'm really focused on, is I do think we need evidence-based decision-making, but I think that evidence has to be objective and not subjective. And unfortunately, what we often see from policymakers, and I've been a policymaker myself 3 times, is a somewhat subjective choice of what they choose to view as fact-based. And I do think that that's a problem. And I also think you have what I view as the objective decision, and then you have a certain amount of policymaking when it comes to spectrum sharing. And one of the things I would urge, and Doug, I've been on the CSMAC, and this is something I do believe, is that there really needs to be a real rethinking of how we manage spectrum in this country. because traditionally we've been supposed to use the public interest, but the public interest has been redefined in so many different ways over the years that I think even with objective facts, you still have the overlay of the public interest when you're coming to sharing decisions. And there seems to have been a walk away from technology neutrality. And when I talk about technology neutrality, I don't mean equal. You know, passive services can't always win and active services can't always win. But you have to have a standard, and you have to be able to walk away from certain things. You know, one of my concerns has always been with auctions is that money talks. And even though the Communications Act says you're not supposed to take into consideration the money coming into the treasury, that's still a consideration. So that's why, so I don't know if that answers your question, Doug, but it's kind of some of the issues I've been struggling as I prepared for the panel. Thank you.
No, I think those are very good points. I think your arguments of evidence, subjective versus objective, is very interesting. And one of the things that I know I and others deal with, it's not just public interest. I guess this is public interest, but some of the stuff we have to deal with are the national security issues that aren't always public and that need to be weighed in consideration of the other evidence. And so sometimes that is not as public as we wish it could be, but need to be weighed by the importance or critical nature of many different missions of the federal agency. So your point's well taken. And let me just ask Chris or Dr. Zazair if they have any comments on this first question.
Yeah, I do. Thank you.
Yeah, Chris.
Thank you. Thank you, Silicon Flatirons. I've been participating on the technical side of domestic and international spectrum policy making for a decade and a half, and I have seen a slow pivot towards better evidence to improve decision making. And I don't speak for the FAA, but as an engineer involved in several domestic and international programs, data-driven is a common phrase that you hear. More so now than before, but it's also a central idea of several of our domestic programs. So evidence is becoming more and more important in decision making, not just or policy making, not just in spectrum, but a lot of other aspects of operating big things. Spectrum policy making usually involves a technical analyses or several technical analyses to guide users or to guide specific assumptions, maybe provisions or limitations in some cases, to ensure that new policy doesn't impact users operating under the existing policy. And we appreciate that those studies being data-driven. I know data-driven is a phrase that's probably overused, and evidence is more refined though than raw data. So how does it get refined? In several of our programs, domestic and even some cases in the international work, we present studies to committees or organizations. Maybe they're federal advisory committees, maybe they're standards development organizations. And the intent is to accumulate support for key parameters that you would like to end up in the policy. And this process typically involves the evidence being analyzed by both sides of the issue, for truth, but also for relevance to the case that you're trying to make. And ideally, that review process provides better evidence that may be used at the decision and policy making levels to improve the outcome. And I think everybody's idea of improving the outcome should be that you have successful sharing and compatibility in the end, post policy making activities. Ideally, this validation process from all stakeholders' perspectives includes or improves the chance of coexistence in the end.
I guess to add a couple of final thoughts, Doug, I come to this panel as a radio astronomer, but I really wanted to pick up on something that Dale Hatfield said yesterday. When we think about sharing between active and passive, every active transmitter actually has a receiver that is passive to actually detect that signal. Things like altimeters, or if you're transmitting some signal, you have to receive it. And so often when we think of passive services, we're thinking of radio astronomy or Earth remote sensing because they're so sensitive, maybe 1 million times or more sensitive, but we're actually still detecting a signal that is naturally transmitted, such as from a black hole or from the sun. So one thing that I wanted to bring to this conversation is first discussion of that, acknowledging it. But second, I really liked what Eric Berger mentioned in the keynote in terms of reframing the question. So when we ask about evidence, what is the hypothesis that we're actually trying to address? And then that drives what data we need to collect. And I wanted to mention, this was discussed a little bit yesterday. There's several kinds of evidence. We can look at models or sharing studies that are often simplified. We can look at experimental data in the field. We can look at, the legal precedent that's set, for example, in the radio regulations or in the FCC record. But we want to know what is the hypothesis so that we can then explore how to actually move forward. And so when we collect the data, I just wanted to emphasize that I really think your assumptions matter, and you need to be clear about that. The simplifications that you make matter. And finally, your experimental design matters when you actually collect that data. So for example, when you're trying to do sharing studies with the military, if you only did it during the day and not at night, you might think there was no issues. So you need to make sure that you do the right experimental study. Maybe you evolve that study over time if you get new information. That's kind of the scientific method, that you continue to collect new data and make those revisions to your experiment as needed. So those are just some thoughts, as I think about evidence and how to get the best information we need moving forward, because it is a continually evolving process. We're never going to be set.
Thank you. Ashley, I appreciate that. I'm going to be jumping around here a little bit. So when, usually when we think of sharing between active and passive, they're geographically dispersed. But what are some of the motivations to share spectrum between active and passive services? Are there, is it all one way? Is it, example, all cellular companies just simply needing more spectrum? And I'm not picking on the cellular companies. Or do passive services need additional spectrum as well? And Ashley, I'd like to specifically kick that to you first and ask you if, when you're answering that, are you aware of any new phenomena that would require larger or new passive bands from the NSF or from your own experience? Do you see anything coming down that, because historically, a lot of these passive bands have been, identified by physicists and not engineers, whether it's hydrogen lines or the frequency at which water vibrates for meteorologists. Those are not dictated by engineers, but physicists. So I'm just curious, as you answer that, if you see any need for new or larger passive bands.
So the answer is absolutely yes. The bands that are protected for passive services were noted for being very special spectral lines at rest. So for example, the neutral hydrogen, where we can see our galaxy at 1400 megahertz, discovered by Carl Jansky when he was searching for noise in a receiver. But the cutting edge of astronomy and research is actually much broader bandwidths, looking to collect continuum data, other kinds of emission mechanisms, looking at those spectral lines redshifted. So if we're looking for the epoch of reionization, this is kind of the earliest moment in the universe where you can see hydrogen. That's actually shifted to about 70 megahertz, which is not a band that's protected for astronomy. So over time, astronomers have been able to get around this by choosing sites that are geographically remote. But a challenge that we're now facing is that the geographic quiet zones are no longer adequate to protect our sites. So for example, the National Radio Quiet Zone only requires coordination from ground-based transmissions. And so as we think and we move forward, I think a good way to move forward is another thing that Eric mentioned is both geographic, but also temporal sharing. Is there a way that in at least certain geographic sites, you can consider having access to certain parts of the band for very special experiments, similar to, having access to a road in New York City for a marathon for a very special purpose, but then most of the time you do actually use it for a different purpose. So, I mean, it is definitely the cutting edge. A lot of great science that's been done in the past 10 years has been using spectrum that we don't officially have allocations in, but we're able to use because we go to those remote geographic locations.
Great, thank you, Ashley. Others on the panel? Would you like to jump in on the motivations to share spectrum between the passive and active providers or users?
I could add a little to that if you'd like.
Sure. Is that Chris?
Yeah, it's Chris.
Well, I can't go wrong. I know it's Chris.
It's at least one of them. Yeah, the aviation community benefits from what you would consider traditional passive service, mostly a meteorological application. We don't operate systems that operate in passive services, although there are similarities that Ashley has pointed out, in particular to radar receivers and passive system receivers. And we have several examples of where passive services such as radio astronomy or ESS passive, I'm sorry, that's an acronym, Earth Exploration Satellite Service passive, and meteorological satellite services operate in spectrum adjacent to aviation systems. Many of these examples have been around as long as the aviation systems, and we have some systems that have been around for 70 years. But to us, the distinction between passive and active isn't that important to sharing and compatibility. If they have a recognized right to operate or somebody needs new spectrum, as we do at times, we try to figure out how to make it work. A receiver is a receiver. There are different processing details that might make some things more difficult than others, but the approach that you take to trying to figure out coexistence is similar to between passive and active services.
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah,
let me go ahead, Chris.
Yeah, thanks. I just thought I'd chime in a little bit on a few of the things I've heard. So one of the things that really jumped out at me was the discussion that Ashley had about the hypothesis testing and really trying to understand the mechanisms by which one system or another is interacting and interfering with another. I just wanted to kind of weigh in from the industry side from a bit of a practical perspective that, the better the hypothesis, the better, the lower the cost and burden in terms of time and resources on a company like Hawkeye to help. If we're told, hey, there's a band and we need to protect it and we need to search for anybody who's in this band anywhere in the world, the bill is going to be much higher than if there's a precise hypothesis that says, look, we know of these types of services that are interfering on a regular basis. We think it's accidental. We think these people don't even know who they are, but this is a geographic area or this is a time of day. Anything that can help with the hypothesis of what might be wrong, I think that the more mature that thought process can get, the more we can direct assets to police it at a low cost.
And Doug, I'd like to weigh in too, if I can. It's Jennifer.
Yeah, Jennifer, please.
So since I'm the only commercial operator, I know Chris is commercial, but not involved with monitoring. So first off, I want to make it clear, at least from my view, I can only talk for myself. I think we understand in our companies I've worked have always understood the importance of the passive services, and they're important from so many levels, public interest, national security, and so forth. And I particularly think I've had a good experience working with NSF and other folks who we've had to work with to protect, though sometimes I have been known to throw snowballs at radio astronomy stations in Hawaii, but when I get a little frustrated, but I would do that at cellular operators too and others. But I think the one thing that's really, I'm happy to see over change, years ago, and so I think it was Work 2000, there was a debate over what band was going to be made available for IMT, and there were 3 bands under consideration: a military band, a weather band, and my band. At that point I worked for MCI, and we were MMDS, which is now BRS. And there was no question that weather was being taken off the table and being protected. So it became a fight between military and commercial uses. And ultimately, we ended up with an outcome that worked for me at the ITU. But I think the point there was we just took it off the table. And I think with evidence-based decision-making and what we're seeing more and more is that it's not just a yes or no issue anymore. And this is true for all the bands. It's a maybe issue, which goes to Ashley's hypothesis, which is we're starting to look at this. And by using, I still can't get used to evidence-based, I'm gonna use fact-based decision-making. But by using facts and looking at things, maybe there is a way to share, and maybe it's temporal, as Ashley said, or something else, or maybe there's not. I mean, there's still going to be certain bands which, I'm sure we're never going to share in, and I would say that even for active bands, some of the satellite bands may be too sensitive. So I really think, Doug, what I'm excited about, and what I think I've seen over the career, my length of career, which I think is a little longer than Chris Turney's, is that we're starting to look at things, and because of fact-based decision making and the willingness of folks to engage, we're making better use of the spectrum resource.
Yeah, thank you, Jennifer. Let me pull on that string for a minute. And I did hear before from Ashley the comment of new technologies, et cetera. We've historically, passive and active have been separated geographically or in adjacent bands. And I know this is not a group of engineers. But Chris, I apologize for just probably insulting you as you are. The question I have is, are there new technologies or technologies that you see coming down the pipe or that exist today that would allow for co-sharing of spectrum between active and passive services in the same band within the same geographic area? Maybe some type of time syncing, et cetera. But I just wanted to hear if any of you if you have thoughts on that.
I mean, time syncing is inherent to just about everything that uses any kind of networked RF energy. And so I see zero technical barrier to, a quiet moment of the day that is scheduled for measurements to be made. That could be done in a way that is not invasive to service, depending on how long it would take to do that measurement. But yeah, just the high level point is we keep track of time, down to fractions of a second, and so I don't think any operator could try to claim that they don't have the ability to mute their transmitters on a schedule.
Thanks, Chris. And for the audience, that is like for a micro or a millisecond, you would go silent and allow the readings to take place and then turn them back on. Chris, I think that's what we're saying here. That doesn't work for all, but in some cases, that may be a solution to get us the sharing within the same geographic and within the same band. Others have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, Doug, this is Ashley. I'll weigh in just very briefly from the National Science Foundation perspective. So the technology definitely exists. So if you look at, for example, radio receivers, they collect data on very, very, very small time scales and then tend to average that to get down to the sensitivity they need. So you can imagine, as Chris was saying, time sharing on nanoseconds, where if someone's transmitting, you can not be observing in that particular time. But this is going to require us to take a step towards a much more automated spectrum management system that's machine to machine, and not sort of something that's going to have to go through humans and take hours or days. And so this is something that we're definitely hoping that we can put research funding towards in specific geographic zones. So I think Tiaga spoke about it on the first day, looking to kind of catalyze this concept of national radio dynamic zones, where we can really try to work out the details of this dynamic sharing in some very small places, similar to what CBRS has done, but try to start expanding that. Because the technology is there between machine learning and artificial intelligence. It really just has to be implemented.
Yeah, no, I agreed, Ashley, and I know that's something that NTIA has been looking at also, but I do believe that it definitely has to get to a machine-to-machine application for it to work in that time frame, those milliseconds, et cetera. So we've been throwing out a lot of stuff to the audience, and I think sometimes it's hard I had to think about it when you start thinking passive and active services and systems on everyday life, to understand the impact of the passive systems on everyday life. And could we just take a second here, because sometimes that discussion, the policy discussion, gets a little esoteric, and maybe if we could help with the audience a little bit of understanding what type of impact passive systems have on their everyday life. And Ashley, you talked about the weather forecasters, public safety, et cetera, but I know all of you come at it from a different angle. So if you just take a minute and talk about the impact and the importance of the passive systems, that would be appreciated. Okay.
I can kick off real fast, Doug, just to add a couple of other passive things people don't think about. So your GPS, to know exactly where you are. The Earth, we have to know its orientation. And so observations of galaxies far away actually help to provide the most precise Earth orientation, which is really important. That's something that the Very Long Baseline Astronomy, VLBA system, contributes to. Additionally, none of us want to get hit by a gigantic asteroid, so NASA leads a planetary defense program to detect and characterize all potentially harmful near-Earth objects. And then we use radio astronomy to actually bounce radars off of these objects and characterize and understand, do they have a possibility of hitting us? So that's something else that hopefully will never impact our lives, but is a very important mission. And again, you can see that it's time critical and limited, pieces. It's not something all the time. And then a final thing that I think impacts all of us is the issue of solar flares. This is something that can impact all communications. And so we definitely want to make sure that we're understanding and monitoring our sun, and we can have a sense to be able to predict when we need to move our communications into a protective mode. And so this is where, radio astronomy observations of all these stars out there seems like it's just, basic research, but that's what's led us to understand how stars evolve, how they die, when they flare, when they, might blow up. So this is the kind of thing that may help us predict when we might get solar flares, based on the 11-year cycle that we do already know about. So those are just a couple examples I thought I'd throw out there.
Now, thank you, Ashley. And I know we don't have a meteorologist on the panel, but the passive satellite sensors at the 24 gigahertz for, as I mentioned earlier, for the vibration of water, which is used for forecasting models for everyday life to help forecast hurricanes, tornadoes, et cetera. So I know there is quite a bit of important soil measurements for climate change, et cetera, that is used on the meteorologist side. So there are a host that I'm aware of, but sometimes people just don't relate passive to their daily lives and what it means to their daily lives that they use every day, like GPS. Anybody else have any comments on that question?
Yeah, I could add some tactics that we use in policy making on the technical side. And yeah, it is hard for the general public to understand many of these things. It's hard for us to explain to our families what we're doing. Policy discussions oftentimes do seem esoteric, but that's important. There's importance there. Evidence, which is the central theme of this conference, does help with that. And we in science, the scientists and engineers, we are usually terrible at marketing. But the more successful ones learn over time, many times from losing issues, that no one is going to care about what you are trying to achieve unless you can explain it well, and you can explain it well to diverse crowds. There's a proverbial, the science doesn't leave the laboratory unless you can communicate it well. Evidence is a powerful tool that we have used in helping diverse crowds understand what it is that we're trying to accomplish. And there's various approaches. Economic was discussed earlier, but there's also the social approach and a moral approach. In aviation safety, we have to look at all different aspects. Money isn't the only thing that motivates us. And your crowds are going to have different, or these different flavors of evidence are going to strike people differently and in different ways. And it's good to have a good think about it and make sure that you have honest evidence that is speaking to your audience, because most of the time you will be dealing with a diverse crowd.
Thank you, Chris. Now I know we're getting close to going to Q&A. I'm gonna ask a final question here. And then Keith, you can set it up for Q&A. I'd like to ask the panelists if you guys could pull out your crystal balls a little bit and give us an idea of what the most important spectrum policy decisions for active and passive services will look like into the future here.
So I would love to go first on this one, Doug, if that's okay. I've been giving this a lot of thought.
Please, Jennifer.
Thank you. So aggregate interference. I think this is the most unvalued issue. And, I have serious concerns both domestically from FCC. I don't have as much experience with working with NTIA on aggregate and with the ITU. I think, we've got 5G coming. I saw in one of the Q&As, people are talking about 6G already, which is reasonable. We've got mega constellations coming in. Starlink's talking, I don't remember, about 48,000 satellites. I'm concerned from a commercial operator what sort of aggregate interference we're gonna see. We always get, it's never gonna happen, but maybe that was true with a 66 satellite fleet like Iridium or a 3G, 4G world. But I think this is a concern not just to the passive service, but also to the active services. And I think until, and it's interesting, we raised this early on in the early 5G in 2017 in the FCC's 5G proceedings, that this was going to be an issue. And Julie Knapp's view was, who I think is fantastic, my old boss, but Julie's view was it's not a real issue. You don't have to worry about that. And, I worry about it, so I'm sure Ashley loses sleep over it. So that would be my number one issue, Doug.
Yeah, thank you. Jennifer, appreciate it. Others? Chris?
Yes, I'd like to double down on that last one. I really think that the way the various active services that we see being pitched, Starlink, we had OneWeb, we had several others, we have the Kuiper, and everybody seems to want to fly hundreds or thousands of spacecraft that all have transmitters on them, whizzing around the Earth at all different elevations. And I just want to say that I think that sometimes theories are developed to predict how the interference may happen. And they're developed by people who I believe are well-intentioned, but they're also in the business of trying to get a business plan approved and get started. And I would just like to say that I think that the enforcement mechanisms that governments need to have to be able to, I hate to say it this way, but Lord help us if all of these businesses succeed and are all interoperating the way that they are striving to be. History tells us that these very large projects, have a probability of success and failure. But if they were all to come to fruition, we would be in an incredibly complicated situation to just detect how they're interfering, let alone trying to predict why they're interfering and how to mitigate that. So I just, I think governments around the world are going to have to really invest in evidence-based collection mechanisms if they're going to have a chance of enforcing some of the licenses that they're granting.
Very good points, Chris. Appreciate it. Anybody else on the panel?
Yeah, I'd like to triple down on that, actually. In most of our studies that we've done, we're always including an aggregate factor, we're always including safety margin, and we are always attacked in our studies with those two things. One, because they're easily not understood, and two, because they are necessary. And, they stopped making spectrum a long time ago, but these applications and users are exponentially increasing, encroaching on other users from both directions. We in aviation, we benefited a long time from exclusivity, but those days are long past, and it's going to get more and more difficult to ensure adequate operations. And we will likely see more oops from poor or missing evidence in policymaking. But that is the right approach. The right approach is having a mature, filtered, high quality evidence to help drive decision making. The passive services are under the same pressures, and it takes hard work and dedication to the mission to maintain sharing and compatibility. As for recommendation, the biggest lesson that I've learned is that giving the subject matter experts the ability to be less certain, either initially or maybe less worst case, by giving them an opportunity to re-examine sharing and compatibility periodically or after evidence has been collected, is the best way to make efficient use of the spectrum. Many times the attitude or the process is, once this decision is made, time freezes and we're going to be stuck with whatever it is, and there's no going back. Drive towards squatting, that drives towards extreme worst case in studies. And it's an unfortunate mitigation to, I would say, poor policy making in the past. Not in every single instance, but certain examples in particular. A better way is through a more flexible approach, which would require different business models maybe than we have today or we're used to. Specifically, an incumbent would be more trusting if there was an assurance that they can recover the desired level of performance post policy making.
Okay, I'm gonna.
No, those are excellent. Go ahead.
Well, as interesting as this conversation is, I need to interrupt so that we can have a few questions before the panel is over. So, sorry, this is fascinating. I was really enjoying it.
I'm not online, so I don't see the queue, so I apologize. You want me? I'll go ahead and I'll introduce Corianne Zacher to ask the first question of the panel, a former student. So please, Corianne, please ask your first question.
You're on mute, Corianne.
Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for being here and for sharing your experience and your insights. I think we heard a consensus that at least some degree of data is crucial to spectrum sharing, but as you've all mentioned, there are some data that the federal government doesn't collect and make available, and that information would be really important for effective spectrum sharing. Could you talk a little bit about specifically what information would be helpful and how that could improve spectrum sharing decisions?
I will ask Jennifer, from an industry standpoint, do you have any thoughts out of the gate? Because that may be.
You know, I think there's a broader issue, so I'm not going to be able to say specifically what. And I'm a lawyer who plays an engineer at TPA. So, but I think the issue is there's a lot of information that's not available. So I'll give you an example. In getting full information, you know, because so much information is commercially sensitive or is claimed to be commercially sensitive or claimed to be sensitive for whatever reason, it's very hard to do a full analysis. So EPFD limits are a way that we share with NGSO systems, GSO operators. You know, and unfortunately the way the ITU's rules work is a system could be launched and operating and then could fail to meet the EPFD and you wouldn't know beforehand. But if we could have that information, I'm sure there's other things. Ashley seems to be shaking her head, so she may have a better example for me than me. But you know, it's that sort of information. What we often find is if the other party's not willing to share that information, that's one thing. Oftentimes, countries go into the ITU process, for instance, and just refuse to give the information, and you can't have a full sharing study. So I think it's very fact specific. I just want to touch Pierre, if it's okay. Pierre had asked me a question about why I'm using fact-based and not evidence-based. Evidence-based doesn't mean it's factual, Pierre. If you look up the definition, it's facts and information. I'm very focused on what's actually facts, and information has a very broad term in my view and can be used to game things. So that's my reason that I feel strongly. So that's, I don't know if that's really the answer Corianne's looking for, but that's, I think, having the information you need and having it available. You know, I'll give you an example. There's a fight right now between Starlink and some of the people on a sharing issue, and Starlink saying, we won't give it for anything but this particular use. And the problem is it could be that the analysis shows something else and then it's not usable. So those are the sorts of things. And I'm sure I claim the same thing. So I'm not saying I'm holier than thou, but it is an issue.
And sometimes it's not even a lack of facts or evidence, is just disagreements on who, as you said, Jennifer, you said the fact, but we can even disagree on the facts at time in policy making. And that goes all the way back to your subjective versus objective comment. So it really does depend on what is needed based on the bands you're talking about, the situation you're talking about. You know, does military sit in that band, does weather, et cetera. If we're talking about sharing in this context, it really does vary by situation. Do others have any comments on this question, or we can go to the next one?
I could just add that it's a very good question and it's a very difficult answer. Mostly because interference is in the eye of the beholder or the receiver that's receiving the interference, and that's very hard to come up with a standardized way of producing a set of data that would be useful. And for example, you may have a scenario that would be harmful interference to a GPS receiver or a radar receiver, but the very same interference source would be tolerable to a communication system that has much higher signal to noise or much higher, can tolerate that particular type of interference. So it is something that's important, but it's not something that's trivial.
Good point. Good point. And Keith, if these are coming in on the Zoom Q&A, I cannot see them. So if you could ask those questions if you're seeing them, or somebody
Okay, I think
else.
we have time for just one more question, and this one came for Ashley. From Gregory Lappin. 6G cellular standards are now being written that include the use of terahertz frequencies. Is it realistic to think that terahertz small cells could be made to coexist with radio astronomy monitors?
Thank you. This is a great question, and one that we actually studied in great detail the past 4 years. And so in the terahertz region, the atmosphere, you have a lot more attenuation from signals. And so sharing is much easier between cellular devices and radio astronomy if you just put sort of geographic restrictions around where you actually want it to be transmitted. So, you know, I think at sea level, you're talking about tens of feet. You can attenuate most signals that would be used for small cells. And so if you have a radio telescope, for example, the US, we operate, I think there's one in Arizona, one on the mountain in Hawaii where Jennifer was throwing snowballs, and one down in Chile up at the Atacama. And so, you know, at those heights, you're not going to be impacted by 6G at the ground. So definitely, I think, you know, that's the attenuation when you have a lot of atmosphere really does help you. And that's something that can be taken into account. So yeah.
Okay, and now, unfortunately, we're due for a quick break. Everyone can go grab a fresh cup of coffee. Thank you so much to this set of panelists and Doug for moderating. This was a very fascinating discussion, and I know there's been a lot of talk on the chat line about this, so thank you all. Let's take a break. We'll reconvene at 11:30 Mountain Time, which is 1:30 Eastern. Thank you much.
Thank you, Keith. Appreciate it. And thank you to all the panelists. Appreciate you guys taking your time. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Doug and Keith. Thanks, everyone.
Yep.
Hi, Stephanie.
Hello. I had to unmute.
You know Cheryl Roby by any chance?
Not real well, but I intersected her a lot in the early days of SCO. And we were trying to bring some of those folks up to speed on some of the DoD PNT challenges.
Okay. She lives down the street, and I thought I'd seen your two names together on some things at one point.
Yeah, there was definitely a lot of, particularly in the PNT domain, which is kind of nice. As I went on to other things at DARPA, oops.
We okay?
Looks like.
Oh, goodness.
Well, welcome back, everyone. Our final panel of the conference is on resilience in position, navigation, and timing, or PNT. I will be the moderator for this panel. We have a great slate of panelists lined up, and I think you'll find it fascinating to learn about some of the unexpected ways in which all of us depend on PNT systems. I think it's fair to say that our modern world would not be possible without PNT. So let me introduce our panelists, and if they can all pop on their video and audio. First to introduce is Dana Goward, who is president of the Resilient Navigation and Timing Foundation, which I think says all you need to know about why he's on the panel. Tim Godfrey is a technical executive at the Electric Power Research Institute, or EPRI. It was surprising to me to learn about how the electric utility industry is so dependent on PNT. Another panelist is Stephanie Tompkins. She is currently the Vice President for Research and Technology Transfer at the Colorado School of Mines. I met Stephanie and had the pleasure of working with her when she was a program manager at DARPA, where she was leading programs on GPS-free navigation. And our final panelist is Jade Morton, who is a professor in the Aerospace Engineering Sciences Department at CU, and also president of the Institute of Navigation. So welcome to all of you. Thank you very much for participating in our conference. I'll lob the first question out to Dana. So Dana, PNT actually affects our everyday lives, perhaps unbeknownst to most of the population. Can you identify some of the ways in which we depend on PNT systems?
Sure, and thanks for the introduction, Keith. And first of all, let me say that PNT today is mostly synonymous with GPS. And one of the ways that we have at our nonprofit of demonstrating that is a little applet on our homepage that shows this particular little picture at an airport. And there's just about nothing in this picture that is not impacted by and supported by GPS services in some way. So we've got it set up so if you mouse over the credit card machine, you see that it's connected to a network, and network synchronization depends upon GPS timing. Trucking, of course, transportation, all modes of transportation, including air travel, depends very greatly on GPS. You'll also see as you mouse over, there are a couple hyperlinks at the bottom of each pop-up that gives you more access to a paper on each one. Folks would probably be interested to know that even weather forecasting is dependent in some ways on GPS, because weather forecasters measure the very slight differences in how GPS signals are received on Earth due to moisture content. Things like precision agriculture. Very, very important to precision agriculture because it greatly reduces the amount of pesticides and the amount of fertilizer needed, makes agriculture much more efficient, and also reduces the ecological impact of fertilizer and pesticides. Of course, there's law enforcement, maritime, the military, rideshare applications, and I think we even have something for the stores over here, and financial systems. All of these things, just about every network technology that you can imagine, and many non-network technologies like digital broadcast. So for example, the criticality in broadcast and land mobile radios is due to the GPS timing is used for spectrum efficiency. The very highly precise timing signal allows multiplexing or multiple conversations on the same frequency at the same time. So incredibly broad, silent, and essential utility that very few people completely understand the impact of.
Wow. Out to the other panelists, would anybody like to add to that from their specific domain of expertise? Stephanie?
Sure. One other thing that's sort of always intriguing is what both the location and timing information from GPS offer to science, particularly when you think about distributed sensors. So a lot of times, in order to study something, you're gonna leave an array of sensors somewhere unattended for extended periods of time. These might be monitoring like seismic signals or sound signals or things like that. But in order to combine that information later and figure out what really happened, you have to have very precise information on the timing. And if the sensors move at all, then you certainly need to know where they were as well. And so a lot of pretty profound discoveries are coming out of that type of application of sensors combined with PNT.
Interesting. Jade?
Yeah, I also would like to add something, and I think Dana have heard me talking about this before, is the sensing part of the GPS or GNS. He had mentioned briefly about, GPS has been used to provide information about moisture content in the air. But GPS actually does a lot more than just sensing the moisture in the air. GPS has been used to look at the space weather, which can have a huge impact on infrastructures on the ground or in space. Even though they may not happen as frequently as the meteorological weather that impact our lives, but when it does happen, the damage or the impact can be so huge that we have to worry about it. And GPS become, I would say, probably the most popular or relied tool to do that sensing. On top of that, there's another area of GPS. It's become its own field. It's called GNS reflectometry. It's looking at the reflections, which we typically don't really like because we call them multipass. It impacts our range measurement accuracy. So for years, navigation community treat them as a nuisance factor. We have many experts who work on the field of mitigating the multipass. But today, the multipass reflections have become a very important tool for us to study a lot of properties of the Earth's surface. For example, we're using them to retrieve ocean wind speed and look at soil moistures, inland water bodies, their extent and their evolution. And so these are all reflected signals that's picked up by antennas mounted on the bottom of aircraft or satellites. And they give you almost instantaneous coverage all over the world because we have so many satellites transmitting signals that it's already there, available. So those have a really high impact for things that, will impact your life that you may not be aware of. And but they are there, and they are really getting a lot of use.
Tim, did you want to add anything to the conversation here?
On this first topic, I will talk more to this later, but definitely Dana could add a point on one of the light fixtures in his little cafeteria illustration there that would point to the electric power delivery being very much dependent on GPS timing synchronization. So I'll have more of a chance to talk about that later in my next question.
Okay.
We do have that, but I didn't want to spend the whole day on the thing.
Okay, well, let me turn to Stephanie for the next question. So Stephanie, past 10 years ago, there have been a number of proposals in spectrum policy that had potential impact on PNT systems and satellite systems in particular. This is a conference on evidence-based policymaking. So what kind of evidence could or should be used to inform these policies?
So when it comes to sort of spectrum associated PNT technology, so the evidence is going to include everything from out in the field, real world collection of data. So you're going to be collecting information about signals that you receive and looking for interference, looking at things like multipath and other issues that, as Jade has just mentioned. You're going to probably also be doing a series of controlled experiments, possibly in the lab or in some type of outdoor field setting where you can actually look at very specific aspects of signal behavior. And then you're going to use a lot of physics-based modeling in order to sort of take what you do know and propagate that out through scenarios that you can't necessarily measure in. I think the world is moving more towards also using machine learning techniques where you're gathering lots and lots of data and then you're learning directly from what's actually happening in very complex situations where the physics models can't quite bring everything together. But it's worth pointing out that with all of that, in a world that's very dynamic and really complex, you can't completely reconstruct real world scenarios with perfect prediction. So I think evidence also does include and has to include sort of testimony and information from users as to what they're observing, what they're seeing, and what the impact might be, so that the modeling, data collection, and sort of anecdotal cycles can kind of circle off of each other in order to get as much information as possible. But having said all of that, collecting the evidence and interpreting the evidence are different things. But I think we're going to get to interpretation a little later on in the Q&A.
Okay, does anybody want to follow up on that?
So I like to say that I'm in favor of evidence-based, or as one of your earlier speakers said, fact-based proceedings. I'm also in favor of motherhood and apple pie. So I'm not sure that's really, those are really issues that are disputed, but but I think, as Stephanie said, as we'll probably get to later, it's a matter of what you do with what you have in terms of evidence and facts, and that can be often as much a matter of social and individual psychology as it is science.
Jade, did you want to add to that, or? Yeah.
Yeah, I think she covered it really well. Yeah.
Okay, so it was interesting for me that you brought up modeling, Stephanie, because I don't think that's really been brought up before in this conference. And there's always the issue of constructing and validating the models. Any suggestions for how that can be done in this domain? Not to put you on the spot, but let's.
It's a little unfair, Keith, because I think you're much the expert. But, well, I mean, to give people an example, this is not strictly related to P&T, but, you know, I've worked with folks in the past who were struggling a lot with sensors that were operating along the ground, and finding that their assumptions about how radio waves were propagating within a couple of inches of the ground surface were not at all what they had actually expected. And so there were clearly other things going on. So in order to improve their models, you have to do all of those things that I said. You have to go out and you have to collect a lot of data. And then you have to start going back and trying to look at what you understand about the physics and interpret what might be causing the discrepancies you're seeing between what you predicted and what you actually observed. And so, you know, again, all of those tools sort of come to bear, and then ultimately, hopefully you can improve that model, and then that model can then be extended to many, many applications and improve overall system scale models and predictions. So I think there's a lot of things like that where direct encounters of signals with the real world don't quite behave exactly what you expect, especially the closer you look. And as things get more complicated, we have to start having these finer and finer resolution sort of models, and there's a lot of work yet to be done.
Which seems to say that the modeling is the beginning, not the end of the discussion. Yeah.
Totally agree.
Okay, so let's move on here. So Jade, we've learned a lot about our dependence on P&T and talked about how policy can affect this. What does it really mean for P&T to be resilient? I mean, this is your research area. What mechanisms can we apply to get resilient P&T?
That's a really good question. How many hours do I have?
How many days do you need?
Yeah. So, well, I will try to make it kind of more concise. Indeed, it's an area that we've spent a lot of time, I mean, 2 decades, you know, and not just me, many of my colleagues have been working in these areas. And there's no silver, is that called the silver bullets or something like that in this country? You have this term that can, you know, one thing can solve all the problems. So it's really about taking the approach from multiple fronts and hoping that together they could get, you know, they could make sure we have resilient P&T solutions. So one of the first line of defense typically is to make our systems more robust, to make our receivers more robust. So that involves every stage of the receiver design, from antennas to the front end, and to receive signal processing and to post-processing. So, from the antenna perspective, people have been doing arrays and allows people to do beamforming, so you can kind of, close out interferences or sources that could, degrade your signal to noise ratio, and clever algorithms that allow you to steer the beams. And in the front end, we're talking about building hardware that that can block unwanted signals more, and create more steep filter edges. And the receiver signal processing is where people have spent a lot of time on. All sorts of algorithms have been developed to not only mitigate those impacts, but quite often being able to identify, even characterize all these different unwanted factors. And that's a lot of people work in that area. This is where a lot of research is happening. Now, there's a limit about how much you can do about that, because it doesn't matter how hard you try. The adversary could always jack up their power, have better, clever schemes to trick you into doing things you don't want to. So sometimes the second round of defense is coexistence. Okay, I've got to get my navigation solutions. What should I do? And so we've done some assessment about coexistence, is how bad a situation it is where we can still coexist, generate a solution to meet our requirement. And that usually is not a highly desirable scenario, but you got to do what you have to do. The third area is about augmentation. And when things are getting bad, you really need the solution. What do? That's when you pull all the other tricks out of your sleeves. You start going back to, how did we navigate before we have a GPS? You start bringing the inertial sensors. You start bringing other radio signals. We call those signals of opportunities, things like your cell tower, your LTE signals, or network signals, anything that is in the air that gives you information about the distance between the receiver and the transmitter, that somehow could constrain your navigation solutions. So it's very active research areas, alternative sensing, and quite often we don't really want to just use them as a standalone, because why can't we use whatever GPS is available? Maybe there's still one signal coming from a particular direction the sky was not blocked and was not jammed. Maybe you could use that. And so this augmentation is also a very, I would say, very big field, and it has been really good in helping us to improve the resilience of PNT. And now, there are times we might need a backup system where it can work standalone. And this is when, like the original Lorenz system and other terrestrial-based navigation system. But today we start talking about potentially having maybe either augmentation or standalone, maybe not coming from a MEO anymore, like GPS, coming from LEO constellations. And it has its pros and cons. These are all very active research areas that we're engaged in. They're just a lot of approaches. And I think in each of those fronts, we're making progress. And hopefully, all we wanted to do be one step ahead of adversary, and being able to offer the kind of solutions when we need it under all these circumstances.
Dana?
Yeah, thanks. So I certainly agree with everything that Jade said, but in the larger context, I think it's important to point out and remind everybody that PNT is not a system, it is a service. It is a critical service, and systems engineering tells us that when you have a critical service or capability, then you need multiple independent sources of it so that you have better redundancy, and also in the event that one of them is faulty, the other sources will outvote the faulty one, for example. So as a completely different example, I used to fly a helicopter that had 3 methods of controlling the flight controls. One was electrical, and 2 were relatively independent hydraulic systems. Right? So if one of those systems failed or was faulty, the other 2 would allow you to retain control of the aircraft and not crash. So I think we need a similar kind of systems analysis and approach to P&T services to ensure that if space is not available to us, then the world doesn't go to heck in a handbasket. That there, as Jade said, that there are other ways of getting it, either fiber, terrestrial broadcasters, or some other way. And that really is the definition of a resilient service. In fact, DHS defines resilience as something that's difficult to disrupt, and then when it is disrupted, it comes back online relatively quickly without a whole lot of effort. So, so that's the way we think about it at our foundation. Certainly protect the frequencies, toughen the receivers, but also augment a holistic approach to resiliency.
Stephanie, I see you kind of leaning forward.
Well, it's kind of like Jade started. It's like, how much time do we have? But I think given how completely and really succinctly everyone else has covered it, the only thing I would add is that you can also think of maybe resilience as expanding the capacity, or the capability of navigation to places where GPS doesn't go. And so a lot of the same technologies that both Dana and Jade have been talking about with respect to augmentation are technologies that in some cases were sort of born out of trying to figure out how to get GPS capability in areas where the signal simply doesn't effectively penetrate. So under lots of trees.
You lost your sound.
Uh-oh.
I can hear her, yeah.
Yeah, I've got you too.
I got you, yeah. No.
Okay.
Fine.
So inside buildings and underwater, and in my particular case, coming from Colorado School of Mines, we care a lot about underground, and having signals that behave the way GPS would could take all of the amazing capability that GPS has given us and sort of take it into whole different dimensions of sort of civilization and society. So those two kind of go hand in hand, and it's nice that a solution in one space might actually help the other.
Tim, since you're one of the industries that really depends on PNT.
Yeah, I can mention that I also saw a question come up on the alternatives to GPS for resilience. And one of the things that's going on that it would not necessarily apply to all the cases where it has to be wireless, but for fixed applications such as power substations where precision time is needed. The IEEE and IEC are working on what's called time-sensitive networking to allow fixed terrestrial networks over fiber to improve the precision of the precision time protocol that's already been used but has been limited by the nature of the backbone networks running on fiber and microwave.
Great.
Maybe
go ahead.
I was going to add something, mainly because what Stephanie was saying, that at the School of Mine, you care a lot about underground, where I'm in aerospace engineering, so we care a lot about the space. So things like, navigating on the moon, Mars, and interesting enough, I right now have 2 student teams doing senior projects. One is doing navigation on the moon, another's what about Mars? And interesting enough, both of them are using the architecture of GPS. So they call it GPS-like navigation system to launch, say, LEO satellite, well, not LEO, I said LMO maybe, around the moon to broadcast signals similar to GPS. So it was really kind of, taking me back a little bit to know that the impact of GPS has, that's the first thing come to people's mind, is let's, it worked so well on the surface of Earth, let's do it out in the space as well. And, but, we know we have issues on Earth, but space is a different, a frontier there. So quite interesting perspectives of how technology expands in different dimensions.
Interesting. Let me go over to Tim. Your industry is dependent on PNT, and I guess most of us don't realize how much our electricity and lights and so on depend on this. Do you have any examples of evidence being used or misused to create or modify spectrum policy in this area?
That's a great question and a complicated one. I'll approach it from three points. The first is directly to the topic we've been talking about, is the GPS timing synchronization. And in the bulk electric power system that forms the backbone of the 3 grids that serve North America, much of this energy is transported on transmission lines that are operating above 300 kilovolts and are carrying hundreds of megawatts of power. And to protect those lines, if there are fault or instability conditions, action has to be taken in significantly less than 1 AC cycle, which in North America is 16 milliseconds. And to do that, it has to be significantly faster. So these decisions are being made on relative phase angles of the signals at both ends of a link, which could be great distances apart. And that is where the precision time synchronization comes in. And the implementation that's been widely deployed is based on GPS, because it is available, but because of availability and even cyber threats to GPS signals, the industry is now looking very closely at ways to make that more resilient. In EPRI, we have a project called Resilient Time Synchronization. It's bringing together the power and protection disciplines with our telecommunications disciplines that I'm involved in. One of the underlying reasons for the need why we can't just go back to doing it over the fixed fiber networks is because the industry has gone through a transition from the historical synchronous optical networks, or SONET, to IP and packet-based networks, which are at a low level at the physical layer, operating asynchronously and no longer provide a master clock that's synchronized to a picosecond or such as that you had in the past. So that brings us back to that opportunity for working with IEEE 802.1 on TSN to improve the precision of terrestrial fiber networks as a backup for precision time. So that's point one. The second point related to our topics is the use of shared spectrum for grid operations. You know, as Eric mentioned in the keynote this morning, that the CBRS priority access licenses were just auctioned. 9 electric utilities won those licenses and will be deploying operational grid control networks based on CBRS spectrum. So this is something that's entirely new. And we at EPRI will be working with those utilities and trying to gather data and evidence on the effectiveness and operational impact of running a network under the control of a spectrum access system operating in shared spectrum. And tying it back to the PNT, those CBRS networks operate exclusively in a time division duplexing mode, which means they're rapidly alternating between uplink and downlink. That also requires precision time synchronization between the base stations to prevent them from interfering with each other. Third point, where we have seen examples of evidence-based policy going both positive and negative, is in the area of the 6 gigahertz report and order that they came out this year, which has been widely publicized as a boon to unlicensed operation for Wi-Fi and other things. But there's also a lot of concern that many critical utility links that are used for the teleprotection, as I was mentioning on the first point, as well as other operational networks, are currently conducted on licensed spectrum links operating in that same 6 gigahertz band. The FCC will allow the unlicensed devices to operate under specific rules, and through this NPRM process, there's been significant debate. It's all on the record of positions, and a lot of paper analysis has gone on, but this policy decision was made without any actual field data or testing to support the conclusions. So from the concern of the utility industry is that these links are operating on a very long tail of a reliability curve. The reliability is 5 or 6 nines or 5 sigmas out. So even a small change in the interference profile out at that level of reliability, where we're talking about a number of seconds per year of outage, could have significant impacts. And the utilities that operate these links and the power distribution are responsible to the regulators to ensure that they have designed and can operate their communications and the grid to the level of reliability that's required by those regulatory agencies. So this is another area that we'll be working with our utilities to understand the impact and gathering data and evidence as these unlicensed devices come into the market and we start to see them in the wild, in the field. So, thanks.
Yeah, thank you. Stephanie, you're leaning forward again. Do you have a comment on that, or?
Well, I wasn't really leaning forward, but I can throw in just maybe a slightly different perspective. I think Dana wrote, either authored or co-authored a really interesting piece about the difference between different communities and how they might understand the same actual evidence in physics. So I'm not gonna try to jump in his way in talking about that, but I will throw out a little example that I always remember. It had to do with the fact that when we were working years ago on a navigation program, dealing with the problem Jay just mentioned, which was multipath, where GPS or other navigation signals are bouncing, and essentially it means they're forcing them to go, those signals are going longer distances than you might have been calculating, and thus you get your navigation information incorrect. We used a commercial software package to model the multipath, but it was designed by communications people. And it took us months to figure out that they rounded off the speed of light just enough to completely screw up all of our predictions. But it had never occurred to us that anybody would think to round off the speed of light. But in the world of communications, you don't need to be as precise as you do in the world of navigation. And so that fundamental kind of cultural difference led to, I cannot tell you how many, middle of the night panic attacks we were finally figured out. So just it's not really misuse of evidence, but it's sort of a cultural mismatch that can lead to an accidental series of very profound mistakes. So that's sort of my 2 cents on this topic.
Oh, that's really interesting. Dana?
Yeah, so Stephanie, that is an amazing story. I've mentally jotted that one down. I'll come back to you if I don't get it precisely right and make sure. But yes, absolutely right. As I mentioned earlier, it can be a matter of individual and social psychology, as you say, your background and your community. So just as some specific examples of the differences between P&T wireless and communications wireless, right? So in two-way radio communications, the receiver looks for an unknown message, but it's a strong signal pushing through the noise. It's about 100 times typically stronger than the background noise. In P&T, or one-way, I should say, in GPS with one-way satellite radio navigation, it's a known message, but it's an incredibly weak signal. It's about 1% of the background noise. So your receiver is looking for a coded signal down in the background noise, while the sun and the stars are making 100 times more noise than the signal that you're looking for, right? So the receivers work. It's great. It's a miracle of technology. But you can see right there, there's a incredible difference. In a radio, a communications radio, if you get a little static, well, it kind of degrades the quality of the communications you're getting. If you start to get a little static in a GPS receiver, it will start to wander off and tell you you're someplace that you're not. So a great example of the cultural differences in background is I was on a panel with Doug Smith, the CEO of Legato, and I made some statement like the Legato tested GPS, and by the way, Legato and the government did similar testing, kind of came up with similar results, but understood them completely differently. So at the panel, I mentioned that Doug and his folks had tested GPS receivers to failure. And Doug corrected me and he said, no, we didn't test them to failure. We just tested them to the point where they were giving bad information. And I'm saying, well, one, for a navigator, that sounds like failure to me. And two, that's worse than the receiver not working at all, right? Because it's bad information.
Right.
So Doug's not a bad guy. I'm sure he's, you know, good to his wife and kids and trying to run a company. And there are no villains in this story, but it's just folks from completely different backgrounds with completely different, different understandings, looking at the same physics and the same phenomena and interpreting it in their own lens. And Keith, you can send a link to that article that Stephanie mentioned if you would like to everybody in case they want to read my nattering on.
All right. Jade, you want to follow up on that?
Sure. Since you guys are into this topic, I would like to also interject something from really also different cultures and the way they understand problems, the way they utilize the information. And since I do a lot of remote sensing applications, one of the things we do is develop receivers that can monitor space weather. And there are products out there that you can buy and deploy at the various locations to do the monitoring. And interesting enough, the kind of space weather phenomenon in equatorial area and the high latitude are due to opposite of the physics. In equatorial area, there will be these very thick, large plasma bubbles, and which will actually impact the signal amplitude very much. So you create fading, so your signal is weak. In high latitude, there will be bursts of smaller structures that will, you can think of them as these small random plasma clouds drifting across your line of sight of your receiver to satellite. And so as a result, and these plasma clouds will create basically the atmosphere delay would change and as they move along it. So you create range fluctuations or phase measurement fluctuations. So you think about it, if you have a large phase fluctuations, your tracking loop really can think of this signal as if it has a very high dynamics. It's as if you're grabbing the satellite, moving the, back and forth. So you need a receiver that has a wider bandwidth in order to accommodate. It's as if your platform has high dynamics, okay? But in equatorial area, because the signals are fading more without this kind of dynamics. So what you really needed is a receiver that can process weak signals. Normally we want to have very narrow bandwidth to allow you to squeeze out more noise. So you can see the designs are opposite of each other. Although they are both due to the same physical name or phenomenal name, which we call atmospheric scintillation. So, but you can't just buy one receiver that's optimized for one and put them both in north high latitude or equatorial area. But that's what people do all the time. So what happened is that the algorithm is optimized for one, but not both. Because if you do well in one, you're bound to really mess up on the other. But people continue to take data and use data to analyze the science out of it. And that obviously can be extremely misleading. And so this is really a lesson where, engineering and science really have to come together to achieve the kind of optimization that we need. And instead of just, blindly believing something and apply to all cases.
Oh, interesting. We've got to move to our Q&A from the audience now. And our first question is from law student Connor May.
Hi, well, first of all, thank you all for a great panel. This has been really interesting. And this question may be born out of ignorance, but I was just curious, given how clearly critical these systems and services are, whether you all have a perspective on whether the incentives are properly aligned to support information sharing, whether government entities provide forums for that or industry groups to ensure that best practices and whatnot are really being used to increase resilience and safety, or whether that's something that you think there could be improvement in.
Anybody want to volunteer for that one? Dana?
So that's a really good question. And I don't know that I've ever thought about the incentives that way, which may mean just to be evidence of my complete ignorance, or that it hasn't popped up as a big deal. In my sense is that as I mentioned, everybody's trying to do the right thing. But what we might need is some more professional cross-cultural interchange and understanding. So in the article, I said, well, should it still be the Federal Communications Commission? Because just the name carries a lot of baggage and presupposition and assumptions with it. Maybe we are at a point, or well past the point, where it should be the Federal Spectrum Commission, and it includes all kinds of folks in terms of the engineers, technologists, and policymakers on it that have backgrounds across the wide use of spectrum, not just for communications.
Okay, did I sense you wanting to weigh in on this, Tim?
I could mention that in terms of industry groups to deal with, at least on the specific issue of the 6 gigahertz activity, which isn't specifically around PNT, but is definitely a spectrum policy issue. The FCC, and as far as I know, it's a new precedent that in the report and order they asked the industry to create a multi-stakeholder group to work through issues that emerge. So they're not taking it on themselves, but they're delegating it to the industry to come together and try to bring all the parties who are stakeholders, which involve electric utilities, commercial cellular, broadcasters, and public safety, and many others on the fixed services side to work with the unlicensed users to discuss and hopefully develop resolutions and mitigations to any problems that emerge.
Anybody else want to attack that question, or shall we go on to the next one?
Thank you.
Thank you, Connor. Good question. So we have a question from the audience about could the panel address non-GPS technologies that are used for PNT and the respective pros and cons? Jade, I think I'll toss that one out to you first.
Okay, thank you. That's a very good question. It's also a very big question because there are many different techniques that we use that are non-GPS based PNT. So depends on what they are, the pros and the cons are different. But in general, typically when we wanted to use another technology that will augment GPS, that's because they have somewhat different properties or quite often opposite. For example, inertial sensor probably is the most common to go technology as alternative PNT, and which acts very much the opposite of GPS. GPS is absolute positioning, and so when you get position fix, and you may have a large arrow, depends on the technology itself, of course, but that arrow is an arrow that's in a 3-dimensional space, and you basically have your X, Y, Z, or latitude, longitude, altitude. But inertial is just the opposite of it. It doesn't give you any absolute position solutions. It gives you a couple measures. For example, maybe your acceleration, and which can be double integrated back into displacements. And what is that displacement tool, relative tool? That is not known. So, and the inertial tends to be very high rate, very low noise, again, depends on the grade of the inertial sensors. Unlike GPS can be noisy, especially code-based navigation solutions. And so when the two got together, you have the best of the both worlds. And inertial cannot be jammed because it doesn't rely on any other signals other than gravity. As long as you live on the surface of Earth, you got it. So that's one of those properties. But there are other signals that you use to augment the GPS, like radio signals. Quite often, those radio signals are much stronger than GPS. GPS is weak. A nominal GPS signal is about 15 dB below noise floor. But your communications, cellular network, and all those other things, they tend to be stronger. But they are not universally available. And they also typically don't have good geometry. Most cities may have a hill somewhere. All of their TV stations, all of their towers are sitting up there. You got all the signals coming from the same direction. Unlike GPS, which is very well distributed, has good geometry. And there are other technologies like laser, camera, and even magnetic field. Some people even propose using auto, and if you have some auto transmitting device by using devices that can sense odor. But all of these devices, they tend to be not readily available everywhere. And they all have their own limitations, but in some ways they augment what the GPS can do. So if you wanted really comprehensive answers for that, it had to look into that particular sensor. And the key again is, diversity. You use properties that are orthogonal to each other, and that's your best solution.
Great. Dana, you had something to add to that?
Yes, so when addressing that question, it's important to remember that the question includes positioning, navigation, and timing, right? So a number of things offer positioning and navigation, but they don't offer time. There are a number of ways to get time, like fiber, but don't necessarily offer you navigation. I agree completely with Jade, and in fact, China probably leads China does lead the world in terms of a comprehensive approach to PNT services for both government, military, and their general population. They have a PNT, their own PNT satellites at MEO, just like GPS is. They are looking at putting satellites at geostationary orbit and establishing satellites at low Earth orbit. So they have a triple redundancy just in space. They also have for decades maintained a terrestrial LORAN system, which they are in the process of expanding further to the west. So it will be an entirely complete backup for signals from space. Now, LORAN is a terrestrial broadcast that we used to have in the United States and in Europe that is in excess of 1 million times stronger than GPS. And not only is it not in space, but it has a thousands of kilometer long waveform, so it penetrates very well. And you don't need a space shuttle to get to it. You can drive to it in a Ford 150 in terms of you need to make adjustments to the transmitter or change the software, right? Russia, China, as I mentioned, South Korea, Saudi Arabia, all have some version of LORAN systems. And in fact, the British still have a LORAN transmitter providing a timing signal. All of this, so former federal bureaucrat, I tend to run on, I apologize, but all of this to say, yes, on what Jade said, you need a system of system, multiple systems with dissimilar failure modes so that you're not relying on one, and if something goes south, even in a big way, like there's a solar flare and all signals from space are not available, you're still going to have those essential positioning, navigation, and timing services that you need. And in fact, today or tomorrow, our foundation has a paper coming out on a resilient national timing architecture that posits we need a GNSS, we need to reestablish the LORAN system here in the United States, upgraded to eLORAN, and a improved timing system over fiber so that everybody has 3 paths just for timing. And by the way, if you build the whole thing out, you'll also have positioning and navigation as well using LORAN.
No, great, thank you. Okay, and with that, we're at the end of the time for our panel. Thank you very much to the panelists. I learned a lot on this. I really appreciate the time and energy you spent preparing for this. Thank you. So everyone, for the audience and the previous panelists and so on, again, also thank you for participating, attending. Stay tuned to the event page. We will be preparing a conference report and additionally posting a video record and transcript of the event within a couple of weeks. Before we head to the breakout rooms, I'd like to make some special acknowledgements. First of all, thank you very much to Amy Stepanovich, the Silicon Flatirons director, for all the support we were given in planning, organizing, and executing this event. And thanks to all the supporters of Silicon Flatirons that were listed in the program. Without their support, we wouldn't be able to hold events like this. And again, thank you to all the speakers, panelists, moderators. I know how much time and energy you all spent in preparing for this, and I really appreciate it. And we were the benefit of all this energy you did. Thanks, of course, to the Wolf Law School and Dean Jim and Aya for supporting Silicon Flatirons in this conference. And I want to specifically acknowledge Pierre DeVries and Dale Hatfield, who co-organized this conference and put in a lot of work and mental energy into organizing. And as always, I learned a lot by just being able to work with them. But I want to close with a special shout out to the Silicon Flatiron staff and students, because they did all the behind the scenes work that made all of this actually work. And they did a great job at it. So can I have a quick round of virtual applause for everybody? Thank you. And so now we're going to go to these virtual breakout rooms, although they're really virtual tables, to enable networking with the speakers. So this is an important part of every Silicon Flatirons conference. We're doing our best to do it virtually. I believe everybody should have received a link to AirMeet, which is the browser-based platform we're using for the breakouts. So please, when you go to AirMeet, log out of Zoom, connect via the AirMeet link that was sent to you by Heather Martin. Each breakout table will have the name of a speaker from today, and speakers will have to join their own tables. And then attendees are encouraged to wander around, join any table, switch when you want to, and ask follow-on questions. To join a table, you simply click on an empty seat. To all of the moderators and panelists and speakers, please remember that you too have to take a seat at your own table. Otherwise, it doesn't work. So thank you all. This was a great event. I really appreciate everybody's time and energy and attention on this. And so with that, let's head out to the breakout rooms.